Welcome to another deep dive, where we grab a big stack of source material and pull out all the core knowledge and the surprising insights just for you.
It's a shortcut to becoming seriously well-informed and having those aha moments.
Exactly. And in this deep dive, we're tackling Richard Dawkins' The Blind Watchmaker.
Which means we'll be exploring evolution and nature of complexity and a lot of the arguments around natural selection.
Dawkins covers so much ground in this book, from the nature of scientific debate
to biological complexity to how bats echolocate.
plus the fossil record and alternative evolutionary theories.
It's really a fascinating read, and we are going to encounter some truly surprising facts.
Okay, let's dive in.
Dawkins begins by contrasting genuine belief with debate for the sake of argument.
He makes it clear that he firmly believes in evolution.
And to illustrate, he tells this story about debating someone who advocated for creationism.
But after the debate, the guy admits he didn't really believe it.
He was just practicing his debate skills.
It really emphasizes Dawkins' commitment to truth in scientific discussions.
It does. And this leads him to discussing the classic argument from design.
Ah, yes, the famous watchmaker analogy.
William Paley laid this argument out in his book, Natural Theology.
The gist of it is that seeing the complex design in nature suggests a conscious designer.
Just like finding a watch with all its gears and springs implies a watchmaker.
So intricate, so well designed, someone must have made this.
That's the basic intuition behind the argument, and Dawkins actually admires Paley's clarity and conviction.
But then he goes on to present Darwin's theory of natural selection as a far more convincing explanation.
For that same biological complexity that Paley was pointing to.
So let's unpack this concept of complexity. What do we mean by complexity in this context?
Dawkins distinguishes between mere heterogeneity and true biological complexity.
Heterogeneity is just being made up of a lot of different stuff, right?
Exactly like Mont Blanc, it's made up with lots of different types of rock.
But a blancmange, which is quite uniform, is equally simple.
The complexity of a living thing is not just about being heterogeneous.
So it's not just about having lots of different parts, it's about how those parts are organized.
Precisely. It's a special kind of organization that demands a special kind of explanation.
An explanation that goes beyond just basic physical laws.
He illustrates this with a dead bird and a live bird thrown into the air.
The dead bird falls predictably obeying gravity.
But the live bird flies away, seemingly defying those simple physical predictions.
Of course, the live bird isn't actually breaking the laws of physics.
Of course not.
Yeah.
But its flight can't be explained by just simple physics.
Because what's happening inside the bird and its muscles and cells is way more complex.
And that complexity results in the seemingly miraculous act of flight.
Okay, so we're talking about different levels of explanation here, right?
Right. Think about a car engine. You can understand how it works by looking at how the cylinders, the carburetor, and the spark plugs all interact.
You could go even deeper and talk about the physics of the metal or the chemistry of combustion.
But that level of detail isn't usually necessary.
So the level of explanation depends on the kind of question you're trying to answer.
And this brings us back to the question of origins, to explain complex biological systems.
We need to think about how they could have arisen gradually in a step-by-step process.
Rather than appearing suddenly in a single act of chance.
You wouldn't expect to find a fully formed watch just lying around. It's obviously the result of a series of steps.
So let's look at some specific examples of complexity to really see what we're dealing with.
The vertebrate eye is a good place to start. It's always been cited as the ultimate example of design.
Dawkins meticulously describes the workings of the eye, how the cornea and lens focus light onto the retina.
But then he throws in this curveball: the photoreceptor cells, the ones that detect light, are actually facing away from the incoming light.
The light has to pass through a layer of nerve cells, first the ganglion cells, before hitting the photoreceptors.
Why are they backwards like that?
It seems counterintuitive, but those ganglion cells aren't just passive connectors.
What are they then?
They actually perform a significant amount of processing.
On the visual information.
Before sending signals to the brain, Dawkins even suggests they act like a satellite computer.
So it's a much more integrated system than you might think.
Now let's talk about another incredible adaptation, bat echolocation.
Nature's sonar system.
It's truly remarkable. Bats emit these super fast pulses of ultrasound.
Up to how fast?
Well, when they're closing in on prey, they can reach up to 200 pulses per second.
200 per second? That's insane.
And to avoid being deafened by their own calls, they have this amazing centrosieve mechanism.
How does that work?
Tiny muscles attached to the hammer and strap bones in their ears contract right before they emit a pulse.
To dampen the sound.
Exactly, and then they relax instantly so they can pick up the returning echo.
So it's like a rapid-fire mute button.
He compares it to fighter planes in World War I that had machine guns firing through the propeller.
Wow.
They needed a similar mechanism to avoid shooting their own propellers off.
That's a great analogy. So how do bats actually interpret the echoes?
Many bats use frequency-modulated calls, or FM calls. They're like wolf whistles that sweep downwards in pitch.
Oh, right. And the pitch of the returning echo tells them how far away something is.
Exactly. Higher pitch means farther away because the echo is slightly older.
So the pitch is like a built-in distance gauge.
But some bats take this even further. They can adjust the pitch of their calls to keep the returning echo at a constant pitch.
Even when they're flying towards a moving target.
Exactly, which allows them to use the Doppler effect to calculate the velocity of their prey.
It's like they have built-in radar guns.
Incredible, right? So we've got these amazing examples of biological complexity.
And Dawkins wants to address the argument from design head-on.
He points out that many modern theologians just express incredulity at the idea that these features evolved gradually.
They basically say it's just too complex. It couldn't have happened that way.
He even mentions Bishop Hugh Montefiore's book as an example.
Where he essentially says it's simply impossible to believe.
But Dawkins argues that just because someone finds something difficult to believe
doesn't make it impossible.
He specifically addresses the claim that spider webs couldn't have evolved gradually.
Because they're so delicate and intricate.
And from his experience with spiders, he says that they absolutely could have evolved gradually.
Okay, so we shouldn't jump to the conclusion of a designer just because something seems too complex.
Instead, we should look for natural explanations like natural sieves.
Sieves that sort out the less successful variations.
He uses the example of planets orbiting the sun.
Only the ones with the right velocity remain in stable orbits.
The others have either crashed into the sun or flown off into space.
So it's not a miracle of design, it's a matter of physical necessity.
And this brings us to the key concept of cumulative selection,
which is the foundation of evolution.
He distinguishes between single-step selection, where you just sort things once and that's it,
and cumulative selection, where the winners are used as the starting point for the next round of selection.
And this process repeats over many generations.
So it's not a one-time sorting, it's about the gradual accumulation of small changes over time.
To illustrate this, he uses his famous computer biomorphs program.
Ah, yes, those evolving shapes.
The program has simple rules that govern branching patterns.
And those rules are influenced by numbers that act like genes.
And then the user selects which shapes they like.
And those shapes are used to breed the next generation.
And you get these amazingly intricate shapes that look like insects or plants.
And the interesting thing is that even Dawkins, who wrote the program, was surprised by the results.
It's hard to retrace the exact evolutionary pathway even when you know the rules.
It shows how cumulative selection can lead to unpredictable outcomes.
Even the programmer can't always predict what will evolve.
So no conscious designer is needed to create complexity.
Dawkins even touches on the possibility of simulating natural selection in a computer environment,
where virtual organisms could compete and evolve.
But it's very challenging to program such a complex world.
Speaking of challenges, Dawkins tackles some common misconceptions about evolution.
Like Goldschmidt's dilemma,
which asks how an early mimic could fool a predator if the resemblance is only slight.
One solution is that different predators focus on different aspects of an animal's appearance.
So a mimic that's only slightly better at camouflaging from one type of predator
might still gain a survival advantage.
And over time, those small improvements can add up.
Another interesting case is the Nautilus eye, which is a lensless pinhole camera eye.
So how did something like that evolve? Wouldn't the intermediate stages have been useless?
Well, even a slightly curved, transparent patch of tissue over a cup-like eye would be an improvement.
It wouldn't be a true lens, but it would help focus the light a bit.
And from there, you can imagine the series of gradual refinements leading to a true lens.
Dawkins says 5% of an eye is better than no eye at all.
And he points out that camera eyes have evolved independently in several lineages,
like in squids and octopuses,
showing that there are multiple evolutionary paths to good vision.
So it's not about having a perfect eye from the start. It's about any improvement being better than none.
He also uses the example of lungs. The massive surface area of human lungs is achieved through branching.
We're talking over 70 square yards.
And this branching structure likely evolved gradually, with each small increase in surface area providing a benefit.
And another example, the transition from water breathing to air breathing in fish.
Even the ability to gulp air for a few seconds could be a lifesaver in a stagnant pond.
And over time, those air-gulping fish could evolve more efficient lungs.
These examples show how complex organs can arise through a series of small functional steps.
So it's not about sudden leaps, it's about continuous improvement.
Now, Dawkins also talks about the dynamic nature of Earth itself.
How the continents have drifted apart over millions of years,
This leads to a discussion of convergent evolution.
where unrelated species in different parts of the world evolve similar features.
Exactly after the dinosaurs went extinct, mammals in Australia, South America, and the Old World all evolved in isolation.
But they faced similar environmental pressures,
So they ended up evolving similar adaptations.
like the marsupial wolf in Australia and the placental wolf in the Northern Hemisphere.
They look and behave similarly, but they're not closely related at all.
It's like nature coming up with the same solution multiple times.
There are many other examples. The giant ground sloth in South America versus other large herbivores.
And even fungus farming behavior in ants and termites on different continents.
Even within ants, the army ant lifestyle has evolved multiple times.
So even though these lineages are separated geographically,
They can still converge on similar solutions.
it shows the power of natural selection to shape evolution in predictable ways.
Now let's delve into the fascinating world of development and inheritance.
How do we get from a single fertilized egg to a complex organism?
Every cell in our body has the same set of genes,
But different genes are active in different cells,
leading to the amazing diversity of cell types we see.
like skin cells, muscle cells, brain cells.
This process is called cellular differentiation, and it's driven by subtle differences in the chemical environment within the developing embryo.
So no grand designer is needed. It's all about local interactions.
And the amazing thing is that DNA replication is incredibly accurate.
How accurate are we talking?
Dawkins says that for a human typist to match the fidelity of DNA replication,
They would have to make less than one mistake for every trillion characters they type. That's unbelievable.
and there are proofreading mechanisms that help maintain this accuracy.
Because even tiny errors can have big consequences.
Then Dawkins introduces this concept of existence worthiness.
What's that all about?
He distinguishes between things that persist because they're durable, like rocks.
And things that persist because they can create copies of themselves, like dewdrops.
Dewdrops are constantly being formed and disappearing.
But the process of dewdrop formation keeps them going.
He argues that self-replication is the key to life.
And that the first replicators were likely much simpler than DNA,
Perhaps something like RNA.
which is also a nucleic acid, but simpler than DNA.
He describes an experiment with the Q beta virus, where RNA molecules in a test tube were able to evolve.
In a test,
Yes, they evolved to replicate faster and even became resistant to a poison.
just through random mutation and selection.
It's a simple but powerful demonstration of evolution in action.
So the principles of evolution can apply even at the molecular level.
Dawkins then explores how DNA exerts its power through the development of bodies and behavior.
It's not just about replicating itself, it's about shaping the organism that carries it.
He gives the example of a beaver. Imagine a gene that slightly alters the beaver's brain wiring.
Leading to a change in its dam-building behavior.
If that change makes the beaver better at surviving and reproducing, then that gene will spread.
So genes don't just code for physical traits, they can also influence behavior.
And behavior can have a big impact on survival and reproduction.
And what about the origin of life itself? That seems incredibly improbable.
People often point to the astronomically low odds of life arising spontaneously,
Some estimates put it at 1 in 10 to the power of 40.
which is a mind-bogglingly huge number.
So does that mean life is a miracle?
Dawkins says, not necessarily. He points out that even if the odds are extremely low on any given planet,
Given the vastness of the universe.
with its billions of galaxies and trillions of stars,
The sheer number of planets out there increases the odds dramatically.
he introduces the idea of the spontaneous generation probability, or SGP.
Which is the probability of life arising on a single planet.
Even if the SGP is incredibly small, it becomes much more plausible that life could have arisen somewhere.
Just because there are so many planets.
It might still seem improbable to us, but statistically it could be quite likely.
So we shouldn't dismiss the possibility of a natural origin of life just because it seems improbable to us.
Dawkins emphasizes that we should always start with the most probable explanations.
And that when we speculate about the origin of life, we have to stay within the bounds of known chemistry and physics.
He also mentions Karen Smith's theory of mineral crystals as potential early replicators.
Clay crystals.
The idea is that certain crystals can reproduce by breaking apart.
And they could have even acted as catalysts for the formation of organic molecules.
It's a speculative idea, But it shows how self-replication might have started with something other than DNA or RNA.
It's fascinating to think about those early stages of life.
Dawkins then uses a graduated scale of improbabilities to illustrate how bad we are at intuitively understanding vast probabilities.
Our brains aren't really equipped to deal with numbers that big.
He points out that our sense of improbability is shaped by our own short lifespans.
If we live for millions of years, our perception of what's rare would be very different.
He then compares the genome to an ancient operating system.
Like the software that runs computer.
He points to the discovery of introns and exons,
Those non-coding and coding regions within genes.
as evidence of a long, complex evolutionary history.
It's like finding remnants of old code in a modern program.
He also briefly touches on Lynn Margulis's theory of the origin of eukaryotic cells
The idea that mitochondria and chloroplasts were once free-living bacteria.
that were engulfed by other cells and became symbiotic partners.
And the fact that they have their own DNA supports this idea.
Mitochondrial DNA is especially interesting because it's inherited only from the mother.
So it can be used to trace maternal lineages back through time.
Now let's talk about genes as cooperatives.
Cooperatives.
A gene's environment isn't just the outside world.
It's also the other genes within the same organism,
So genes are selected not just for their individual effects,
but also for how well they work together.
especially within the same species,
This cooperation is what led to the evolution of complex bodies.
which Dawkins calls survival machines built by gene cooperatives.
So the selfish gene isn't so selfish after all.
It has to cooperate to succeed.
Dawkins also introduces the idea of evolutionary arms races.
Between predators and prey, parasites, and hosts.
Each side is constantly evolving in response to the other,
Like the gazelle and the cheetah. The gazelle gets faster to escape the cheetah.
and the cheetah gets faster to catch the gazelle.
It's a continuous back and forth.
An evolutionary game of cat and mouse.
He also explains the Red Queen effect.
Which says that even though both sides are getting better,
Their relative success might stay the same.
because they're both improving at the same rate.
It's like running on a treadmill. You're putting in effort, but you're not getting anywhere.
He contrasts this with asymmetric arms races, where one side has a clear advantage.
Like a missile versus a jamming device.
In those cases, progress can be more dramatic.
Now, what about the evolution of brains?
How do we measure intelligence in the fossil record?
It's tricky because brain size is correlated with body size.
Bigger animals tend to have bigger brains.
So you can't just look at brain size alone.
You need to take body size into account,
So scientists use the encephalization quotient, or EQ.
which is a measure of brain size relative to body size.
An animal with a high EQ has a bigger brain than expected for its body size,
So a chihuahua might have a higher EQ than an elephant.
even though the elephant's brain is much bigger overall.
It's all about proportions.
So to recap, the key point is that genes are selected based on their interactions with their environment,
And a big part of that environment is the other genes within the organism.
leading to cooperation and the evolution of bodies as survival machines.
Dawkins then talks about our human tendency to analogize,
To see similarities between things that might not be truly alike.
like comparing ant battles to human warfare.
He says that analogies can be helpful, but we should be careful not to overextend them.
They can be misleading if we take them too literally.
He then introduces two interwoven analogies.
What are they?
Biological evolution as an explosion driven by positive feedback.
Positive feedback meaning that small changes get amplified.
Exactly. He contrasts it with negative feedback, which stabilizes systems.
Give me an example.
Imagine a steam engine with a governor that's supposed to regulate its speed.
But the governor is rigged to make it speed up uncontrollably.
That's positive feedback. A small increase in speed leads to an even bigger increase.
Until the engine explodes,
He then discusses Fisher's theory of runaway sexual selection.
where a male trait and a female preference for that trait can become locked in a positive feedback loop.
Like the peacock's tail, the more females prefer long tails.
The longer tails get and the stronger the preference becomes.
It's a self-reinforcing cycle that can lead to exaggerated traits.
So it's like a fashion trend that gets out of control.
He also discusses the idea of a line of equilibria.
What does that mean?
Imagine a room with a heater and a cooler, both set to the same temperature.
The room will stay at that temperature.
But there are many combinations of heater and cooler settings that would achieve the same result.
So there's not just one stable state. There's a whole range of possibilities.
In sexual selection, this means there can be multiple stable combinations of male traits and female preferences.
So there's no single ideal. It depends on the specific dynamics of the population.
Dawkins then draws an analogy between biological evolution and cultural evolution.
So he's saying that ideas can evolve too.
Exactly. He calls these units of culture transmission memes.
Like genes, but for ideas.
Memes can spread and be selected for based on their ability to be copied and transmitted.
Like a catchy tune or a compelling story.
He uses the example of technological progress, like the evolution of vehicles.
From horse-drawn carts to cars to airplanes.
It's a cumulative process where each new invention builds on what came before.
So cultural evolution can also lead to increasing complexity.
Now let's turn our attention to the fossil record,
which provides direct evidence of evolution.
Dawkins acknowledges that fossilization is a rare event.
So the fossil record is necessarily incomplete.
But he says that the patterns we see should generally align with evolutionary theory.
If we found something truly out of place,
like a human fossil from hundreds of millions of years ago,
that would disprove evolution.
He's addressing the creationist claim that evolution is an unfalsifiable tautology.
So the fossil record is important because it could potentially contradict evolutionary predictions.
He then discusses the caricature of gradualism.
The idea that evolution must happen in tiny, imperceptible steps.
He says that the gaps in the fossil record don't necessarily mean that evolution happened in sudden jumps.
Because fossilization is a random process.
We're not going to have a complete record of every single evolutionary step.
He uses the analogy of focusing a microscope.
If you're already close to the right focus,
small adjustments are more likely to improve the image
than big jumps.
So the gaps might just be missing pieces of a gradual process.
He then explains why true saltation,
meaning large single-step changes that create complex adaptations,
is statistically very unlikely.
He uses Hoyle's analogy of a tornado assembling a Boeing 747 from a junkyard.
It's just too improbable for a complex structure to arise by pure chance in a single event.
So it's not about monkeys typing Shakespeare.
He distinguishes this from macromutations,
where small changes in developmental genes can have big effects on the adult organism.
like the increase in vertebrae in snakes or homeotic mutations in fruit flies,
which can change the number or arrangement of body parts.
These mutations have been important in evolution.
But they still work within the constraints of development.
He then clarifies that punctuationists,
like Gould and Eldred,
don't actually disagree with gradualism.
They just think that the rate of evolution isn't constant.
They propose that evolution happens in bursts during speciation events,
punctuated by long periods of stasis.
He even suggests an experiment to test the idea that species resist change.
By selectively breeding animals for certain traits?
If there's resistance, we should see it in the early generations.
Like if we try to breed cows for higher milk yield.
We should see an initial lag before the trait starts to respond to selection.
It's an interesting thought experiment.
Dawkins then emphasizes how important the concept of gradualism was for Darwin.
Because it made the idea of complex life evolving from simple beginnings seem more plausible.
It's hard to imagine a single jump from an amoeba to a human.
But a series of small steps over millions of years is easier to grasp.
Now let's talk about biological classification.
How we organize the diversity of life.
Dawkins explains the hierarchical nature of classification.
And species are grouped into genera.
Genera are grouped into families.
And so on, up to kingdoms and domains.
He points out that a complete fossil record
with all the intermediate forms
would blur the lines between these groups,
making it hard to draw clear boundaries.
He also touches on the ethical and legal implications of our species-based classifications,
which can be arbitrary and problematic.
He briefly discusses species selection,
where selection acts on entire species rather than individuals.
He's skeptical about its importance in explaining complex adaptations.
But he acknowledges that it might play a role in explaining certain evolutionary trends.
Like the increasing body size of horses over time,
which could be due to species with larger body sizes being less likely to go extinct.
He then talks about cladistic taxonomy,
which focuses on shared derived characteristics to construct evolutionary trees.
But he points out that convergent evolution can make this tricky,
because unrelated species can evolve similar features,
making them look more closely related than they actually are.
So appearance can be deceiving.
He highlights the universality of the genetic code as evidence for common ancestry.
But he says that to determine closer relationships,
we need to look at the actual sequences of DNA and proteins.
By comparing those sequences, we can estimate how long ago two lineages diverged.
He also describes numerical taxonomy,
which uses computers to analyze lots of physical measurements
to create clusters of similar organisms.
It's a more data-driven approach.
But there's debate about how to interpret the results,
And finally, he contrasts this with transformed cladistics
which assumes that a hierarchical pattern exists in nature
and tries to create trees of pure resemblance.
without necessarily tying them to evolution.
So different ways of looking at the same data.
Now let's talk about alternative theories to Darwinian selection,
There have been many proposed over the years.
like Lamarckism, neutralism, mutationism, and of course creationism.
Dawkins argues that Lamarckian inheritance
The idea that acquired characteristics can be inherited.
is largely discredited.
There's just no evidence for it.
He uses the example of sun tanning.
If Lamarckism were true, people who get a lot of sun should have children who are born with darker skin.
But that's not how it works.
He argues that Lamarckism would require us to overturn basic principles of embryology and genetics
Like the idea that DNA is a one-dimensional code.
that directs development, rather than being a miniature version of the adult organism.
He uses the analogy of a cake recipe,
Changing an ingredient in the recipe affects the whole cake.
not just one specific part,
So changes to DNA affect the whole organism.
not just a specific trait that was used or disused.
He also points out that in non-living systems,
Wear and tear usually leads to weakening, not strengthening.
so why would biological systems be different?
He argues that Darwinian selection is the best explanation for why certain acquired characteristics are advantageous.
Because those characteristics were favored by selection in the past.
He also criticizes the use and disuse principle as being too simplistic.
To explain the incredible complexity of adaptation,
It doesn't account for the intricate mechanisms,
he then discusses neutralism
which says that some genetic changes are neither beneficial nor harmful.
and can spread through populations by random chance.
But he emphasizes that neutralism is mainly about changes at the DNA level,
It doesn't really apply to complex adaptations.
which are clearly shaped by natural selection.
He then addresses mutationism.
The idea that evolution is driven by large, sudden mutations,
But how would random mutations consistently lead to improvements?
rather than just breaking things.
And we now know that mutations can only alter existing developmental processes.
They can't create entirely new features out of thin air.
He uses a dialogue between a real-life Darwinian, a caricature, and a mutationist to illustrate common misunderstandings of Darwinism.
And he clarifies that the existence of developmental constraints.
Doesn't contradict Darwinism.
It just means that not every conceivable trait can evolve,
Finally, he briefly mentions Gabriel Dover's molecular drive theory.
which proposes non-selective mechanisms of genetic change.
But Dawkins strongly disagrees.
He maintains that natural selection is the only plausible explanation for adaptive complexity.
And that's the main takeaway from The Blind Watchmaker.
That the incredible adaptations we see in nature were the result of gradual, cumulative natural selection.
Acting on heritable variation over vast stretches of time.
It's been a fascinating journey through some complex and challenging ideas.
And we've only scratched the surface of Dawkins' book.
So here's a final thought for you, the listener.
If cumulative selection can explain the complexity of life,
What other seemingly improbable phenomena might be explained by a similar process?
what small steps over time could lead to surprising outcomes?
We encourage you to keep exploring these questions and apply this kind of thinking to the world around you.